think that there is grace, and I think that no one person is perfect or has perfectly lived a life without misstepping, or maybe getting into a scenario that they didn't expect to be in, and suddenly they're feeling remorse.
Welcome to the True North Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Quiring, as always, and with us today is our very special guest, Sheena Van Middelkoop. Welcome, Sheena.
Thank you.
So glad to have you here today. We've got an incredible topic for you, one that I think is so important for us to be talking about today, and one that the church has traditionally done a very poor job of discussing and dealing with. As always, if you enjoy this content and would like to know more, you can sign up to my newsletter at testwithtruth.com. And if you sign up, I'll even send you the first 2 chapters of my brand new book, The Lies That Bind. So let's have a discussion, Sheena, that you and I have been kind of working our way around for a few months now. Let's talk about purity culture.
Let's do it.
Some people don't even know what that term means, and I think we're going to make our way towards it. But what we really want to talk about today is how the church talks about marriage, how the church talks about dating, and the kind of promises we make and the language that we use to tell our kids and the promises that we hold on to, and how God fits into all of that. So our goal for today is to provide a really biblical and honest and grounded idea of sexuality, but also to peel away the layers that culture has added on top of that not only haven't been helpful, but have been damaging for some people. So that's the aim of our conversation today. And some of these topics are on the sensitive side of things, so we're going to do our best to deal with it honestly and transparently, but also in a way that kind of tackles the hard issues at hand. So I appreciate your courage and willingness to talk about this. You're going to hear about this from a married perspective and a single perspective, from a male perspective and a female perspective, and each of us has had our own unique experiences with this. So really excited about the conversation. And part of the reason you and I were talking offline about how this came up is I'm a parent. I have 3 kids, and just this last year or so, I've started to be peppered by questions from my youngest about everything that you could imagine. Fearless, honest, curious questions about faith and dating and marriage and sexuality. And I even remember that my first conversation with my youngest daughter started at 6 years old about same-sex marriage and heterosexuality. So whoever you are in our world today, you cannot escape these questions. And especially if you're a parent, you have to have answers ready and ideas about how to communicate these deep biblical truths. So I want to talk about that today with you. And we want to peel back some of those layers, because the questions that we have been answering with over the last while have been nowhere near as helpful for some people as we had thought. So let's talk about purity culture and what we mean by that. Purity culture essentially is the name we've given to this movement in the States that started around the 90s, especially in like the Southern Baptist Convention, that had a very noble goal, which was to help kids make decisions to stay pure until they were married. And they had a few different examples kind of melded within that. They used to have purity rallies. Did you ever attend any of those?
No.
Had you heard of them?
Yes.
They would have these big conferences with the express purpose of everybody in the room being encouraged to stay celibate until they were married. They had purity rings. So there was an example that you wore, like a visible symbol. I'm not sure which finger it was on, but it was your promise, your pledge by saying you would not have sex until you were married. And then they had these huge pledge drives where you would write your name down with a bunch of other people and sign on for this decision that you would not sleep with anyone until you were married. So one of the questions that we want to ask is, what does that look like today? Where did they get that right? And where did they get that wrong? What has your experience been like with these things? Did your youth group talk at all about purity culture? Was it explicit, implicit? What was it like in the Baptist convention?
It was the popular culture of America was definitely moving into our kind of world. And so we started to see books that were being released, particularly I Kissed Dating Goodbye. And so I don't remember specifically it being the intended goal that they were like, okay, we need to make this our standard and our practice. But I do remember being encouraged to read that, because that's where a lot of the other churches were drawing their inspiration. And how are we supposed to parent this generation? And especially as millennials, I mean, we were on the cusp of things changing.
For sure.
Computers were coming in. We were having access to things we didn't used to have access to. And I think, you know, certain freedoms were on the rise. And I think as a form of safeguarding us, it was how do we keep our children from the world, as it were, and help them. And sometimes they don't want to listen to us. So like, here's a book, or, you know, here's a CD that's promoting all of the same sort of narrative. And it was encouraged. And so I think for me as an individual, I think I'm naturally risk averse.
Okay.
I'm naturally someone who likes to live within parameters that feel safe, because I'm naturally a people pleaser, and I don't like conflict. So it's easier for me to live within the boundaries of something.
Go with the flow.
Yeah, and because I don't want anybody mad at me, and I don't want to be in trouble, and I don't want to ruin my life, and all of those things. So I think there were some people within my youth group who definitely were probably more persuaded to view the world that way. Others were definitely not.
Sure.
And so I think it came down to personal preference.
And it's so important because I feel like the church has done a very poor job traditionally and historically talking about sex.
Yeah.
It just doesn't do a good job of it. Either it's taboo and we avoid it.
That's right.
Or we find unhealthy ways to express it.
Yes.
And I feel like in this issue, we need to first start off and really be clear about the fact that as a church and as parents, we have to talk about this.
You can't. Someone else will.
That's exactly right. Because if you don't, someone else will. And I think that's the conviction that I've started to develop as a parent is if you wait too long to have these conversations, someone else is going to beat you to the punch. And
That's
it's going to be some X-rated website, or it's going to be some TikToker who tells your kid about sex and life and what they can expect. And most of those are fairly poisonous messages that are totally at odds with what the Bible teaches.
Yeah.
And so there's this fine line about the fact that we have to talk about these hard and difficult but important issues.
Yeah.
But what I've been realizing over the last year, partly through our discussions, is we got to be careful about how we talk about it. Just talking about it is not enough. And the just say no movement, just don't have sex, is nowhere near as effective as we once hoped it would be.
No.
I've become more and more convinced that we have to talk about not just what the Bible says, but why the Bible says it.
That's so key.
Like in terms of sexuality, not just save yourself for marriage, but why did God design us that way? Why is this so important? Why is this his image, not just of relationship and family and community, but actually in a biblical and profound and spiritual way, an image of our relationship with God? This is sacred stuff. But we can't just stop at the what. This can't just be a list. It has to be an explanation about the heart of God and his good plan for our lives. I think it's fair, before we dive into some of these conversations, to state at the outset here what you and I believe. You and I won't speak for you, but I believe in the biblical definition of marriage, in the traditional definition of marriage, and about saving yourself for marriage. So this is not something that I have ever wavered on. Would you agree with those statements that I've made?
Yeah.
So there's no question about us talking about the true biblical line, because there's a lot of compromise these days out there about same-sex marriage and all this sort of stuff. So theologically, you and I are coming from the same place. But now we're asking a harder question. How do we talk about that? How do we talk about that in a faithful way? How do we talk about that in an accurate way to the scriptures? And how do we not make promises that God himself doesn't make? And I think that's some of the tough part about all of this. We've experienced a little bit of intrigue as far as purity culture goes this last year. Are you familiar with Matthew West?
I am.
Yeah, well-known Christian recording artist. He released a song and then a corresponding music video. It was called Modest is Hottest, which is it's a catchy title. And what surprised me, and really what it was a whole music video with his wife and daughters wearing parkas instead of the opposite, basically, of cultural music videos where scantily clad women are dancing around. They're wearing parkas and hats and toques, and they're basically saying, modest is hottest. What blew me away was the response from culture. It was so fierce and so quick that even within the Christian community, he had to take that down within 2 weeks. That's how fast and how swiftly they responded. And I think it just shows how sensitive this issue is now and how we need to have this conversation and figure things out from a truly biblical perspective. So let's talk a little bit about the side effects of the language that we use. Let's talk about purity culture and how we make promises. What I heard, and I'll see if yours is the same, but what I heard a lot when I was growing up, the dominant picture I heard was saving yourself for marriage was like your Christmas morning gift.
Yep.
If you wouldn't peek, if you wouldn't peel it back, it would be so much more exciting on Christmas morning when you would open it up, because you would have this perfect gift, perfectly designed. You'd be surprised and amazed by it. And if you saved yourself for marriage, finally on your wedding night, that was what your experience would be like.
Yeah.
Did you hear messages similar to that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
There is a good element to this discussion in the sense that, yes, I think it teaches us that God has a beautiful and wonderful plan for us, but there are some side effects to the language that we use. What has your experience been? What are some of the negative ways that people have experienced or interpreted some of those language kind of models that we've used? Where do you see some of the areas that we need to grow and improve?
Well, I think it's the illusion that by not having conversations, that perfection is going to be waiting for you. And I think it's kind of Disneyed up this idea of life that, you know, if you're good and you behave and you don't do these things, then you will be rewarded. And I think what it fails to do is it fails to prepare us for the fact that actually life is hard. Things are tricky. People come from different backgrounds, different family experiences. They have different hang-ups, different traumas. And actually, a lot of my friends now, like, because I am older and people are discussing various components of their marriage, it's not actually as lovely as we were promised. And I think that then it sets an unfair expectation up for a relationship. And I think we focus too much on that one component rather than actually building healthy individuals. I was listening to some podcasts recently, and we can direct people to some of those conversations because I'm an armchair expert, but I was really moved by one of the statements, and one of the ladies, Deborah Folletti, I think is her name. She's a therapist, counselor. And she said, we would need less marriage counseling if we actually focused on the singles and developing healthy, whole people, because actually, you know, we wouldn't be bringing this into a marriage. And so, you know, I also agree that the why behind the what is so important, because I think it's misleading just to say no. Well, you say no to a child about touching something. Well, they want to touch it.
More than anything in the world, right?
Right?
It's human nature.
Yeah. And so I think that if we had these frank conversations and it wasn't just this like beautiful illustration that we gave them, because that just felt very empty. Yeah. And it's also not very tangible. It doesn't really make a lot of sense because I don't know what to experience or expect within, I don't know how to expect that experience to be. I mean, you presented it this way, but what is the actual tangible reality of that? What does that actually mean to my life and from that point on into my life? So
you're saying your friends that you were talking about, they had an experience where what they were promised and what they ended up experiencing in marriage was two different things.
Yeah, some of them for sure. Yes.
Yeah. And partly to do with the sexual side of things.
Yeah.
Was it this like rosy picture that if you save yourself for marriage, as soon as you begin your sexual life, it will be the most amazing thing you've ever experienced with no learning curve whatsoever. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so maybe we haven't as a church done a great job of explaining that marital sexuality is a beautiful and wonderful but complicated thing.
Yeah. And again, like, I think it is the most vulnerable you will be with someone. Yeah. And actually that requires trust and that requires stability within a relationship. Yeah. It's not about emotionally manipulating or demanding from someone. It's actually about selflessness. But I don't think we're very good at explaining that.
Well, and I think what we've done is we have put all of our eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
We've put all our eggs in, if you do this hard thing for Jesus.
Yes.
Marriage and sexuality will work out perfectly all by itself.
Yes.
Instead of saying, this is incredibly important, but there's all these other relational, personal, and sanctification issues that are going to go into a whole thing called marital sexuality.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's the overly simplistic images that we tend to use is maybe where the church has done a poor job.
Yeah.
I think they've done it from a good place. I really do, or at least it's come from a genuinely positive desire. Yeah. I think that pastors and parents in the 90s thought, we need to fight this epidemic of sexuality, of premarital sex, so we have a good end, and we're going to do whatever we need to encourage our kids to not make that mistake.
Yeah.
But in the process, we end up teaching a very thin version of biblical sexuality, which is this mysterious, beautiful, and even godlike relationship with us image about life and community. So it's so much deeper than we've traditionally expressed.
Yeah.
I remember watching a show that I was forced to watch by my wife. I won't say the name of it, but I, as a good husband, I dutifully watched this show. And in the show, the grandmother, the matriarch of the family, she told her granddaughter that sexuality is like this rose, and you're given this rose at a young age. And she actually hung it up on her wall in her bedroom and says, whatever you do, don't give this away. You'll crumple it, you'll smash it, you'll destroy it. Yeah. And then if you ever have sex before you're married, it's all over, and that's the end. Yeah. And so she grew up with this terrifying fear of sexuality, which is not a biblical image. Yeah. And I think that we have sometimes oversimplified with something like that, a much more complex issue.
Oh, yeah. The fear is a real side effect because the fear was also linked to the fact that if you save yourself, God will reward you. If you fail, you are shamed. Yeah. There's no grace. You know, you've lost this component of life that you can never get back. And actually it minimizes who God is. It minimizes the fact that his love, it says like neither height nor depth nor length nor width can separate us. And yet we said this one thing could actually do that, or at least there was maybe it wasn't explicitly expressed. I just think that there was an undercurrent of narrative that definitely for some of us we could attach ourselves to and then live out of that fear. And so like that image definitely wrote itself all the way through my teen years too. That rose.
Isn't it funny, right? It seems like such a good thing for a grandparent to do, to try and encourage. But I think we end up subscribing to the ends justifies the means in some of these areas. Yeah. And what a lot of kids are experiencing, Gen Z and now Gen, I guess they're calling it Alpha, they're going through this deeply questioning and deconstructing experience of their faith and what they were told by their parents, and sexuality is part of that. Yeah. Now, some of them have done it to a deeply unhealthy degree. They've thrown out everything just because some of the things they were told were maybe inaccurate or incomplete. Right. They've thrown out everything and come to the place where they believe that all sexuality, no matter how you want to experience it, is good. And obviously that's so far off the map. But I do believe that one of the things that we have to teach is that when we step outside of God's plan for marriage, in some way we will experience drama or trauma. Inevitably, that's how things are going to go. And I think when I talk to my kids, one of the things that I tell them is that there's going to be drama and trauma if you step outside God's plan for marriage. But what we need to balance that with is the incredible unending grace of God, that even if you were to make a mistake, and hopefully you don't, but even if you were, God doesn't love you any less. God hasn't abandoned you, and God can still stitch together and move you into a good future. Yeah. So it's almost like you have to hold in tension those incredibly important truths. Don't sacrifice the grace of God to keep people within the purity guidelines that he calls us to. And it's like, that's hard to keep that balance. Usually we're going to err too far one way or the other, but I think we need to somehow try and hold that tension. So it's something that we've got to work on, I think, as a church, and help our kids develop, like I said, and we've talked about a holistic idea of biblical sexuality, that he has a good plan for your life. And if you follow his plan, there are good things in the future, but that doesn't mean, like you said, there won't be difficulty, there won't be struggle, there won't be confusion. And just to highlight again, too, your idea that your friends have experienced is that marriage is complicated.
It's so complicated.
Don't oversimplify all of marriage just by the sexual side of things. Yeah.
And I think because I think as a safeguard and as a hope is, you know, we really encourage young people to get married quickly so that they, you know, that they wouldn't be tempted beyond what we esteemed as right or wrong, and so it was easier to get them married, but then we didn't really prepare them to be married and to be mature. I just think it's unfortunate, because now I'm seeing friends who are divorced, who are struggling with all sorts of components. And I'm not saying that's everyone's story. There are some who have made such a great success of it, who have done so much work in their marriage to work together because they love one another enough that it was worth all of the hard days. But I am seeing the side effects of people who were encouraged without guidance, to is this the right relationship? Is this God's timing? What are your convictions? What are your life goals? Like, do they align? Because at some point, like, I remember someone saying, who is separated, I think probably actually divorced now. But I remember one of the conversations was the husband was really disappointed about the fact that they no longer wanted to participate in some of their extracurricular activities like camping or something. And then she was like, yeah, I'm not 20 anymore and I don't want to do that. I was like, well, this isn't the person I married, you know? And inevitably, like, we change. We change from our early 20s into our 30s. Our priorities are different. Our interests are different. All of those things. And again, I don't think we had those conversations. I think we were just concerned about the don't do it until you're allowed. And that was the goal. And I think we've done a disservice to so many people.
And especially from that negative side instead of the positive. When we say don't do it because it'll hurt and harm you, we fail to mention that if you follow God's plan for you, you will be most aligned and ready for his future. What we have to be careful about is this idea that, and I think you felt this before, like there was almost this promise, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it was almost this promise that if you were faithful in this area and didn't step outside God's guideline for sex, he would reward you with a life full of happy marriage and family and all that sort of things.
Absolutely.
Did you feel that implied promise? Was it hard when life didn't quite follow that path for you?
Yeah, I'll just be transparent. You know, it's an easy thing to become prideful in when you can follow rules well and other people aren't.
Right.
And then down the road, you're like, why are they being rewarded with the things that I was waiting for? But actually, it's a terrible mindset. And I'm so ashamed. And I'm so thankful for God's grace and his ability to mature that. But yeah, like I definitely thought by not dating, like, because the book that I referred to earlier, that I Kissed Dating Goodbye, it really encouraged not dating.
Yeah.
It encouraged courtship. It encouraged not kissing, not doing anything. And so there was this like, okay, that's what God's designed for marriage and for our, like, that's the way that we honor him and we honor ourselves and we honor our spouse or our future spouse. And so you live by that and then you think, okay, I've got it all together. I'm ready. Here we go. And
I'm waiting, Lord.
Yeah. Where is, but you know what my uncle used to say? He said, God can't direct a ship that's moored. So actually, that being said, this podcast I was listening to, she's actually really the opposite, encouraging dating. And one of the things that I wish that somebody would have said is like, dating is actually about investigation.
Right.
It's actually about us learning who we are and meeting and learning social skills and communication skills. It's about understanding that we're not committing to anything. If I were to go on a first date with someone, I think the purity culture promoted this idea that like, if you go on a date, you have to know if they're probably going to be the one.
Interesting.
And it puts so much pressure on like, well, then I just won't date because they're clearly not the one, or I don't think that they're one. And how do I know unless I know them? And it creates this unnecessary stress and pressure, and it's just very unhealthy.
Yeah. That book was a iconic book in the purity culture movement and in my own life and circle. That book was like a plague. As soon as it came out, I knew 10 different couples that broke up within 3 weeks of reading it. Oh yeah, it was like at camp. I was counseling at camp, and then one after another, and it was usually the girl that read it and then came back to the guy that says, I'm sorry, we can't date anymore. I'm saving myself for courtship. The only man I'm ever going to marry is the man I'm going to kiss.
Yes.
I have so many feelings about Joshua Harris, and much of them are frustrating feelings. He released that book late 90s, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
He released that book, and the premise of the book, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is that dating is bad, dating is worldly, dating is cultural. God only designed us to court one another, which I never was quite sure what the difference between courting and dating was.
Yeah.
But court one another. And he made this promise that he wouldn't kiss his future wife until they were at the altar.
Yes.
That is the first kiss that they would share. And then he wrote books after that talking about how wonderful married life was because he saved himself, because he didn't kiss his wife, and because he didn't date. Part of the frustration for me was watching so many of these couples break up and then 2 years later realize that this didn't work out very well at all. And so it was really bad advice. Here's the thing that really frustrated me. Joshua Harris now is divorced. Not only is he divorced, he's given up ministry altogether. He has given up faith in Jesus, and he is now actively leading courses and charging people online to undo what he taught in the past, not just about sexuality, but also about faith. To be honest with you, as a pastor who feels passionately about his congregation and people who trust us, it makes me really upset.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show that the very promise that he embodied in his book, it came to nothing in the end.
Yeah, nothing.
And his wife was the one who left him. So clearly this idea that not dating leads to a perfect life is pretty deficient.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we've got to kind of grapple with some of those ideas. So when we're talking to our kids as parents, maybe if we had a healthy concept of dating, that would be a whole lot better than saying dating's bad, don't do it. Just kiss the girl you're going to marry one day. So that's some of the hard parts about finding that line, but I think we really need to try and figure that out. And Joshua Harris is not someone I would recommend anybody read except to understand the culture that led to this in the first place. So what does healthy dating look like? You mentioned that you would have preferred if someone encouraged you to date. That's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you would have had a little more courage to try it in high school or in college more? Or what do you think it would have changed?
Probably college. My youth years, I was one of the lucky few who had a good group of friends and an active youth group in that, we were really lucky to live in a small town, but feel like our lives were full. I know that's not everyone's story. We didn't live in an urban area. We didn't have a McDonald's we could all hang out on after a youth night or something. But, our youth leaders were some of our parents in a volunteer role and were very passionate about giving us opportunities. So they took us places. They, organized events for us or took us canoeing or various things. So I don't really feel like I needed that then. I really wasn't. I wanted to be in a relationship probably more because everybody else was.
Sure.
And I think there was a component of insecurity because I feel like people were esteemed and feel more validated in who they are because they were desired versus those of us who weren't blessed with the same sort of obvious attraction. And so I think that there was that complexity. But I think in my 20s, for sure, I think you break away from the herd. You don't have your group of friends anymore. You don't have the community, and there is an isolation and a loneliness. And then people's lives are taking off in different speeds and places. And so I think, I think there would have been more of that desire, but I think there was just so much fear around having preserved this idea of not for so long that to do it was really terrifying. And I think because of the pressure of you only date someone that you believe is the one or potentially the one. But I mean, I'm so thankful again. I know that I said that in our previous conversation. I'm just thankful God didn't give me the desires of my heart when I was 20, because when I was 30, they looked very different because he walked me through some really hard things and I had to become more whole and I had to become more sanctified. And, we all have ideas and expectations and those things and those hopes, the reality of things sometimes doesn't always look like the expectation. And so actually sometimes I'm thankful that wasn't the case. However, I wish that I would have felt more secure in myself to know that I was allowed to. Not that I had tons of opportunity, but I was also very actively in play. I have tons of friends, both genders. I've always been very social, I suppose. So it wasn't like I was lacking community or those sorts of things, but I think there is an isolation that you feel because you're watching everybody else do the thing that you'd like to, but you don't feel like you're allowed to, but they're allowed to because somehow you made this decision.
It's funny how purity culture has had various, and again, we're not knocking the biblical concept of purity. I'll say that one more time.
Yeah.
We believe in the biblical concept of purity, but it's how we talk to our kids holistically about it and honestly about it. There have been some side effects to purity culture that people may not have realized. I have a friend who attended Bible college in Florida, and in that Bible college, they were so concerned about the possibility that two people might be inappropriately connected, male and female, that they had separate sidewalks for men and women. You literally could not walk in the middle of day, broad daylight, sun shining. You could not walk on the same sidewalk as a member of the opposite sex because you never know what might happen out there in the open.
Yeah.
You weren't allowed to be in the same room as a member of the opposite sex ever under any circumstances if there wasn't a third or fourth person there. There were these rules all over the place. We used to joke at dances and stuff like that. You should always be able to fit a Bible between you.
Yeah. Make room for the Holy Spirit.
Not one of them tiny little New Testament songs. We're talking big Catholic Bible between you.
Yeah.
And we make jokes about stuff like that, but there were these rules, these expectations about how people would interact with each other that was influenced by us trying to keep them away from making a bad decision. And it just seems like we erred on the side of rules.
Yes.
And didn't dig deeply enough into the side of explanation, into the heart of God.
Yeah.
We should begin to think. Dress code is one of those examples.
Yeah.
It's one that we don't like to talk about sometimes because it's really, really touchy. But I remember when I was a camp counselor, there was this rule that guys could take their shirts off when they played beach volleyball, but girls couldn't. There's an element of which it seems obvious and self-explanatory, but I was amazed at how much discussion was happening about, well, why? Why not? What can a person wear inside and outside, and what can't they? What's the expectation at the beach versus the expectation on Sunday morning?
That's right.
What we think about purity culture and how we're trying to protect our kids and our world, and our dress code has a lot to do with what we believe in these areas and what we teach. So I don't know if you've ever experienced that, certain expectations as a worship leader or as a woman. Have you had people either say explicitly or kind of imply things to you, or dress codes? Have you had any experience in that area?
Oh, yeah. I think definitely the beach was always the point of contention for a lot of people, because going to the beach in your teenage years, everybody is excited to be swimming and having a good time, and suddenly you're like, now you got to think about things differently. The girls have to wear a tank top over, or you know what I mean?
One piece versus two piece.
Yeah, one piece versus two piece, and it always put the onus on one and not the other. And it was kind of implied that it was our responsibility to be careful, because we didn't want to invite unwanted attention, and the responsibility lied at our feet. Or also we didn't want to encourage the men to stumble, and again, our responsibility. And so there is this sense of like, okay, like, am I wearing something appropriately? Like, is someone going to have an issue with it? Thank the Lord for high-rise jeans. I don't care what Gen Z say. If they're out of style, they're forever my fave. Because growing up in the 90s and the early 2000s, the low-rise jeans was the worst, because they just never fit right. And so there was this component of wearing like tank tops under your shirts so that you could tuck in so that nothing ever exposed itself. And I think that, that was also a self-preservation method, but also I think it was this whole idea of making sure that you were appropriate at all times. Interestingly enough, though, I think as I grew up into my 30s and I traveled, I realized how different cultures approach this idea and how funny it is, because again, I do think American culture has definitely influenced a lot of Canadian, and probably not quite to the same degree, but it leaches into a degree
100%.
And it shaped us and it formed us and what have you. But then I went to the UK and I had friends from all over the world, and it was very educational. I had a friend from Italy who invited us over for kind of a celebratory end of our intern year, my first year there. It was a really cheap flight, so we're like, yes, let's go. She organized accommodation for us. We slept on a floor somewhere. It was great. And her comment, it was so funny. There's 3 other girls and my friend from Italy. She said to us, she's like, got your bikinis packed? And all 3 of us were like, no. And then she's like, why not? And we're like, and we all looked at each other like, so we go to the beach in our one piece or tankini, modest choice, but also comfort choice. And we're like, oh, everybody's wearing them. Any size, any age, everybody's wearing them. Bikinis, Speedos, just cultural. It's not seemed as immodest or inappropriate. You're at the beach, you're having a good time, this is what you wear. And I was like, well, we were the 3, like everybody was watching us. We all looked like weird. I mean, it doesn't help that I'm really, really like pale and I hide under towels because I'm going to burn after 20 minutes. I mean, that didn't help, but it was funny. It was just such a different experience.
But just to remember, the dress code to a certain degree is cultural. And we have to remember that the Bible doesn't actually tell us exactly what length of skirt.
That's right.
There used to be rules about ankle length, mid, knee, and then in between, and all these different rules. Sometimes we turn those into biblical commands when really what they are is interpretations of a biblical idea. And we got to be really careful about conflating those two. together. You said something interesting before I want to unpack just a little bit. You said that you almost felt like the impression you got was as if a man ever lusted after or had impure thoughts about a woman wearing something, that you felt like it was your fault that would happen. Mm-hmm. Did I hear you correctly?
Yes, you did.
So that was the impression that you were given, that it wasn't their fault, it was actually your fault for dressing immodestly. And if you would have just dressed better, they never would have had that trouble in the first place.
Yes.
That's a pretty heavy weight.
It's very heavy weight.
It's kind of a scary thought to think about. Mm-hmm. I wonder if they didn't necessarily mean to present it that way, or maybe they had never thought about the emotional effect of that. But that would be a scary thing to walk around and wonder if every sin that a man commits with his eyes is your fault because he didn't perfectly dress.
Yeah.
Do you feel like it was evenly shared? Do you feel like the men were talked to in the same way? Or do you feel like it was more of the onus was put on the female?
I do think probably more on the female, probably because the responsibility of the consequence lied with the woman, to be honest. Because if anything happened and you were uneducated and you didn't know how to prevent such things from happening, guess whose shame got to be, known to the rest of the world. So I think guys had a firm talking to, but I don't think they necessarily had a lot of real estate in their mind considering all these things and being burdened by these things. I think they were just like hanging out and playing hockey and living their lives in a different way, I think. But mind you, again, I do think personality plays a big part in a lot of this. Yeah. And I know I had friends who just were like, meh, they didn't buy into any of it, and they just lived their lives. And I do think, again, like risk averse, people pleasing, cautious people probably were a little bit more easily led because it felt safe.
And it's funny, this is one of those circumstances in which there is a truth there, that we do have a responsibility, as much as it is within our power, to help our brothers and sisters not sin. I think where this takes a twist is if we ever give the impression that it's not actually the guy's fault for having a lustful thought, that it's actually all on the woman's side of things. I think that's a very dangerous place theologically to hang out, and it leaves so much pressure on women in those situations. We had a weird version of this. I was pastoring a church not too far from here, and one of our worship leaders decided to wear a tank top on a Sunday morning to lead worship. For some people, they wouldn't even bat an eye at that. I know churches that have worship leaders wearing tank tops all the time. Other worship environments, it's like long sleeve, long pants, nothing but. So I get that this is partially cultural. But we had a complaint from the audience, a man saying that this person was causing me to stumble by wearing that. And we had to figure out, well, what does the Bible say about dress code? Where should the line be? And I'll tell you, that turned into quite the animated discussion. In the end, it blew right up. One of the elders decided to take it upon themselves to go and chastise this woman for wearing that, tell them not to wear anything like it again, did it without the authority of the board or the pastor. She had an enormously negative reaction. I don't even know if she ever led worship again at that church. And so you had a potentially tough situation that was handled poorly, and it just broke apart the relationships. So it's almost like we got to handle this delicately. So yes, if you're on stage, there is a certain element in which you're doing your very best not to cause anyone any distraction on a Sunday morning. Yeah. At the same time, it's not like there's something morally wrong necessarily with wearing a tank top. So it's really, we need to be so careful how we communicate that, that if a man's having an issue in the congregation, yes, we should always, as much as we can, do our best to help our brothers and sisters around us. But that's not necessarily her fault if she's dressed relatively normally.
Yeah. Yeah, because we're all responsible for our own thoughts.
Right.
We are called to take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. And so I don't know what any other person's actual thought patterns and thought lives are. It's not my responsibility. I am responsible for the way that I think, for the way that I behave, for the way that I act, and the way that I treat others. And so that is on me. If I gossip and I say something out of turn, and I blame the person who brought the topic up, and then it triggered a memory, and I'm like, well, it's not their fault. Right. I had a responsibility in that exchange. Sure. And actually, if it's an area that I struggle in, then what am I doing to try and mature and grow and overcome that temptation, that struggle, that area of weakness, whatever word you want to ascribe to it? What am I doing? What actions am I taking? Because it's an easy scapegoat to point the finger at someone else and say, you're the reason that I'm struggling. You're the reason that I failed. And making villains to our narrative and to our life. It's not healthy. And it's unnecessary.
Yeah. So if you were in a situation where you were leading some like teenage girls or young girls trying to figure this out, or guys or whatever it is, let's just kind of backtrack here a little bit. What would we say? Like if the parents are listening or if teenagers are listening, what would you say? What would we say to them to try and turn this purity culture good intention that maybe had picked up some baggage along the way? What would be some positive things or some clarifying things that we could say? It is absolutely true that God has a good and wonderful plan for your life, and we need to teach the why behind the what.
Yes, 100%.
Parents, teachers, youth leaders, don't just say don't have sex. Say God has a beautiful plan for you, and there is blessing. Be careful about how you describe this, but there is blessing within walking within the path of marital sexuality that he has put before us. It is a good thing, and he wants what is good for you. And on the other side of it is often drama and trauma. So that's one thing that I would want to communicate to them, is that this is something you need to know.
I think that there is grace, and I think that no one person is perfect or has perfectly lived a life without misstepping, or maybe getting into a scenario that they didn't expect to be in, and suddenly they're feeling remorse or they're feeling like that. Actually, like, shame hides things in the dark, and what we don't bring into the light, we can't help and we can't heal and we can't work on. And so, like, don't hide if there are things that you regret or you feel embarrassed about or you feel ashamed about. Like, it is better to have those conversations. It is better to make a plan. It is better to help someone through these things rather than to say, no, don't, and then just assume that people are going to submit to that without actually being a person who has hormones raging through them and is trying to navigate a world that's really complex, who wants to feel like they belong, that they're included, that they're desired in the way that other people are desired. And also because they want to have a significant other, and they want to not be alone and build a life that actually, like, there's grace, but also that the Bible does not actually say that that's what we get in this life. And I think that was the other thing that it failed to address, was that not all of us are going to get married, and that actually God is not genie in a lamp where we get to, You
mean he didn't promise us the American dream? Is that what you're saying?
He didn't promise us the American dream.
Life,
he didn't.
love, liberty, white picket fence, 2.4 kids in a small town with a house.
He did not.
No. Shoot, I thought I read that somewhere.
I know.
We talk about it implicitly so much that I can entirely understand how someone would walk away with that impression. And that God's reward for faithfulness isn't always what you think.
That's right.
There's beauty and sanctification and joy and love and peace and gentleness and kindness, the fruits of the Spirit that sometimes come through the single life. And so we got to be careful. I think maybe that's the next thing. We got to be careful what we promise.
That's right.
Don't promise that marital sexuality will go from nothing to 100% in beautiful, blissful ecstasy the day you get married.
That's right.
We should be careful about that. Yes, it is a wonderful gift, but there's some assembly required. If I was to use a perhaps crude example, but I mean, yes, it is a beautiful, wonderful gift, but it's something that you're going to have to learn how to interact with, and that's not a bad thing. But don't set them up to think that the day you turn that switch, it's going to go from off limits to on, and everything's going to be perfect.
Yes. Helping people manage their expectations of their life and of God for their life, because God never made those promises to us.
Right.
And so if we think that we are entitled to certain things because we've behaved and because the end goal is this, because it's the desire that we have, the thing is that he promised he would never leave us nor forsake us, but he didn't say that I would get the husband that I expected to get. Right. And also, I mean, one of the things that I feel blessed with was I had a really lovely group of women who were mentoring me, and in Bible studies, like I was kind of an old soul, and I hung out with people in different generations. I think it didn't help sometimes that they always affirmed that I was such a lovely person that of course I would be married, because who wouldn't want me?
Because lovely people will get married.
That's right. It created this false expectation of God and of life. And so I think we have a responsibility to the children in our lives corporately to help them manage their expectations of life and of God. And I think building character and and building maturity.
Yeah.
It comes through having to walk hard things. It's about learning to deal with the disappointments. Listen, if your kids play any form of sport, they want to win. But what happens when they don't win? Like the objective isn't always to win. It's about what do we learn in this? What can be gained through working as a team and being a part of a team and learning to deal with our disappointment and strength training. I mean, all of those components add, value to the experience.
Yep. So it's almost like we need to rescue the promises God makes from the American dream.
I think so.
Like really those two things are not the same.
They're not.
And we have to be so careful about making those promises, because if you think God made you a promise and then it doesn't happen,
that's right.
The consequences are way more than just disappointment. Then you're mad at God.
That's right.
You feel like he's failed you and let you down. And he's up there saying, I never promised you that in the first place.
Yeah,
it may be ahead, but it may not. I've never promised that.
Yeah.
I think I would encourage, and I think you might be on the same line, I would encourage people to date in a healthy way.
Yes.
Like the idea of courting and only kissing before you're married, we can talk another time about where the line is physically. But I think the purpose of dating is to assess for marriage.
Yes.
And so it's okay if you don't know at first, but be smart about how you do it. Date in groups to start. Become friends first. Spend time alone afterwards once you trust this person enough, but make sure you're in situations that aren't going to cause you to make poor decisions. That's just really important. Dating is not a bad thing. It's not a dirty word, but date in a healthy way that aligns with biblical principles.
Yes. And I think biblical principles is the key, because when people are like, well, we want to date like from a biblical place. Dating is a relatively modern construct.
Yeah.
Like dating is actually new. We're all still actually trying to figure out what dating means, because actually, if you look at like, well, biblical dating, what is biblical dating? It involves, I'm quoting someone, camels, donkeys, goats,
a dowry,
and an arranged marriage. You signing up for that?
Yeah.
It's the principles of what God has, the fruits of the Spirit, like all of those components need to be in our exchanges with one another, whether it's through friendship or dating. There's wisdom that we need to apply in any given scenario.
Yeah.
And so that's what we have to look to. And I love, this idea, like if I go for a date with someone, I do not owe them anything. I do not owe them a next date. Right. I do not owe them 6 months contract. Of my life. Yeah. There is no, I go, we can assess, we get to know one another. Yeah. Okay. Let's do one more. And we go from there. But actually it is about being able to be curious and investigate, to build interpersonal skills and whatever, but it is not this like precious, like I have to know and, and putting all this unnecessary pressure
for sure.
And stress. Be wise, be healthy for yourself as much as the other person. I think when we've turned a lot of it into recreational, and I think that's the other component. Like the pendulum has shifted so much that I think that's another complex thing. Like you can be on an app and dating like multiple people at a time, and I mean, and that's another conversation. But I think it is a lot. And as a parent, raising children, I can see why these questions are really weighty. Like
What did you say earlier? You said that the one thing we were taught as kids was never to talk to strangers, and the other was never get into a car with strangers.
You got it.
And then what do we do now every single day with Uber and dating apps?
We meet people on the internet and we meet them alone.
It's kind of funny when you think about it.
I know.
But again, cultural change. So date healthily. I always tell people, make sure you date someone that you could see yourself marrying one day. Of course. Never just date someone that you know for a fact this is never going to work out. There has to be at least an open door. And if you ever get to the point where you realize that door is no longer open, then it's time to end it.
You got to pay attention to red flags too, both in yourself and that person.
Emotional and relational red flags, not just whether or not they're a Christian, although that's so important.
Yeah. And that's the thing, because somebody can have, like all of these things on your list. You get 6 months down the road and something triggers and you start to see behaviors that are concerning. Like you may need to pause that or decide whether this is worth going down the road if this person is unwilling to address these things. Because the thing is, like I remember my pastor in England saying, like, you never marry someone's potential. You marry the reality.
Right.
And also, whoever they are on the dates is the best you're going to see them at.
People court better than they marry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like they're on the dates, they are going to show up with the best self. So don't expect that when you get into a committed relationship and you move into marriage, that it's going to keep getting better and better with respect to certain things. Obviously it gets better because there's more trust and like you grow together. But at the same time, there's going to be a lot of things revealed and things that are going to need to be dealt with and
because
things that are
marriage
going to
is
be
sanctifying.
hard.
In the hard way, sometimes it reveals the hard and rough parts of us that need to be sanded down and worked with.
And so also, if you notice things in yourself, you need to stop and ask yourself, what is this bringing out? What do I need to address? Like, am I prepared, to work through this so that I'm not actually creating an unnecessary burden on someone else to deal with my garbage? I mean, maybe that's
each person brings their own baggage to the relationship, and if there's a lot of it, it's going to take a while to figure out.
Yeah, that's right.
I think the last thing maybe I would say, and this piggybacks on something you said earlier, is about shame. We should absolutely trumpet the incredible gift of Christian, faithful, biblical sexuality, but we have to be so careful about shame because Jesus didn't traffic in shame, and neither should we.
No.
So whenever you present the good and beautiful side of sexuality and God's promises to us, there should always be a caveat in that. Youth pastors, parents, it's like, but if you ever did make a mistake, I still love you. So does Jesus. And he makes beautiful things out of broken people.
That's right.
So even though that's not what we're encouraging, I think there should always be a pressure release valve there, so that if someone has made a mistake, and statistically, my goodness, it's about 90 to 95% of people these days, depending on which stat you look at, it is astronomically high. There should always be that pressure release valve where the grace of God can take the place of shame.
Yes.
Because so many people walk away thinking, I am broken. My flower has been crushed. It will never bloom again.
My Christmas box has been tainted.
My Christmas box has been destroyed. There's got to be grace in our presentation because there are so many who have struggled here.
Because he redeems all things. We put him in a box and we limit him with what he's able to do in and through our lives and with our stories. I have people in my world who, the order was mixed up, as it were, for those of us who believe and want to honor God in that way. And sometimes the order comes differently than what they planned and life happens. But guess what? Like those children are so incredible and they're so beautiful and God has used them to grow their family and their parents' lives and all of these things. I think God is at work in all things. And I think that, if we remember, like you said, that grace is there, God is not limited
by our own imperfections.
That's right.
100%.
That's right.
And and we need to have these conversations. We need to, parents need to, pastors and youth pastors need to, friends need to. It's like, if we don't, I think you said this earlier, if we don't educate them, the internet will.
Oh, yes.
And that is the last thing in the world that we want.
That's a dark
If
place.
we don't give them a worldview to stand upon that is biblically based, TikTok will. So we need to step into the fray, have these brave and honest and difficult conversations. And so with that, I really appreciate you having this tough conversation with me and just talking about a vulnerable and difficult topic, but so important for us in today's day and age. So thanks for joining us, Sheena.
Hey, you're welcome.
It's been awesome. Appreciate it.